What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video where today we'll make a ray tracing focused comparison between the RX 9070 XT and RX 7900 XTX. I'm going insane here with the XTs and RXs and 79s and 9070s. Oh, AMD's naming sometimes drives me insane. But we're going to look at a few different games with different engines and also point out some hiccups that I ran into with the 9070 XT and ray tracing in particular, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I wanted to start with Cyberpunk specifically because in my previous video we looked at ray tracing in Cyberpunk and how to mod FSR 4 as well. I'll leave a link to that video down below in case you're interested. But I saw a few comments requesting I look at Dogtown specifically because that area of the game is more demanding. And that's what we're gonna do in this particular part of the video. Ask and you shall receive, right? Within reason. I also wanted to thank many of you guys who watched my previous video. It did really well, and we got some new subscribers, so welcome to the channel. Please leave your feedback and requests that you might have. Sometimes that gives me suggestions for future videos, so I do appreciate that. But for this particular part, we're going to focus on 1440p again, and we're going to start with Ray Tracing Ultra and FSR quality enabled. Now, just like we did in the previous video, on the 9070 XT, we are going to use the FSR 4 mod because it actually improves the image quality quite a bit, noticeably so, especially when compared to CD Projekt's Red implementation of FSR 3. And then on the 7900 XTX, which is going to be on the right, we're just going to use FSR quality that is in the game. It is worth mentioning, however, that you could still use the Optiscaler mod to inject FSR 3.1.3 in other games. But getting back to the benchmark, what I did was I divided it into two parts, a driving part and a walking part. Now, the driving part began back there at the slums, and we drove into the big arena where all the vendors are. And the difference in performance here, guys, is absolutely insane. I did not expect to be this big of a difference. And just a spoiler, I guess, for the rest of this video, I did not see similar gains in other ray tracing games. But here, it was insane. We ended up averaging 80 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 60 FPS on the 7900 XTX. I mean, that's like a 30% increase in performance. It's really good. And for 1% lows, we had 59 FPS versus 45 FPS on the 7900 XTX. That is pretty crazy. Now the walking part is inside these vendors. We just basically walk through all the vendors and all the NPCs just to see how the game behaves. And overall, I mean, performance frame time wise, the game was smooth on both GPUs, but on the 9070 XT it was a lot better. Actually, the advantage was even bigger than before. We ended up averaging 79 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 56 FPS on the 7900 XTX. And for 1% lows, we got 65 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 44 FPS. So yeah, as you can see, not only did we get more frames, but also the overall frame time delivery was much smoother on the 9070 XT as a result of the GPU being more capable. That was ray tracing set to Ultra. Now this part we're going to take a look at path tracing, and obviously path tracing is a lot more demanding, so we are going to have to drop to FSR performance, which at 1440p, I mean, I don't think anyone used to use FSR performance even at 4K previously. At least I never would have thought to use it, but here with the Optiscaler FSR 4 mod, it actually looks pretty decent. I mean, yeah, you can tell that it's been upscaled a bit aggressively, but when compared to the game's own implementation, I mean, it's a night and day difference, really. But FSR 4 makes some very good improvements based off the few games I've seen, and I have a feeling that if FSR 4 was integrated in an official way where AMD and CD Projekt Red were involved, I think it might even look a little bit better because there's still a little bit of flickering here and there. But I mean, it's way more stable when compared to the FSR 3 performance. And speaking of performance, the gap here was even bigger. We ended up averaging 61 FPS versus 45 on the 7900 XTX. That's like over 50% increase in performance. For 1% lows, 49 FPS versus 35 FPS on the XTX. So yeah, guys, a very, very big advantage here for the 9070 XT. Very surprising to say the least. In the indoor area, the 9070 XT actually did a little bit better, whereas the 7900 XTX's numbers were relatively very similar. We ended up averaging 65 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 44 FPS on the XTX. And for 1% lows, 54 FPS versus 36 FPS on the XTX. So yeah, a very, very big advantage for the 9070 XT here. And it's also worth keeping in mind that FSR 4 does cost more processing power than FSR 3 would. So if we were to be using FSR 3 on the 9070 XT, basically we would be getting a little bit higher FPS overall. Well, it's not, the cost is not massive, but it does cost a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, the results are very surprising. I ended up checking the settings, everything, it was exactly the same on both GPUs. So maybe AMD, knowing that Cyberpunk is used in benchmarking a lot, I think they've spent a lot of time optimizing this game in their drivers. And I say this because there's other games where I don't think they even looked at all, which we're gonna take a quick look at a little bit later in this video. But yeah, Cyberpunk, it's a showcase type of game for the 9070 XT, as far as this type of comparison goes. Yeah, absolutely. The next game we're looking at is one of my all-time favorites, Control. And we're targeting 1440p native, all settings maxed out, and all ray tracing not maxed out because now they've added ray sample counts, which can make the game a lot more demanding, but a lot more accurate ray tracing. And we're going to do two passes. We're going to do one ray sample count, which is what you're looking at right now. And then we're also going to do 3 ray sample counts. That is the ultra ray tracing preset in the game, essentially. I did also split this benchmark into 2 parts. One where we're walking ourselves to the destination, and the second one where we engage in a little bit of fighting just to see if anything changes at all. But as you can tell, the difference between these two is actually not that massive. On the 9070 XT, we ended up averaging 88 FPS versus the 83 on the 7900 XTX. And for 1% lows, 72 FPS versus 66. So yeah, the 1% lows, the 9070 XT had a bit of a more noticeable advantage, but it just goes to show that the 7900 XTX is still actually very capable ray tracing GPU, but also goes to show the improvements that AMD has made on an architectural level with RDNA 4, because you're dealing with 64 compute units of RDNA 4 versus 96 compute units of RDNA 3. So yeah, that is actually fairly impressive. Although the power consumption, not so much, because it is a power-hungry GPU for the die size. Now this combat part was pretty interesting because if you look at the 7900 XTX on the right, it did end up hitting some disruptive stutters, which impacted the 1% lows, noticeably so. The averages still, though, the 9070 XT did noticeably better here versus the walking around part. We ended up averaging 109 FPS versus 81 FPS on the 7900 XTX. And for 1% lows, it was 72 FPS versus 46. So again, those stutters did end up taking a hit, but those are the results. It is what it is. We're going to do another run now with 3 ray sample counts. That will make the game more demanding, but it'll also make the ray tracing look more stable and better overall. Now this was the recent update that they did. They also added HDR into the game, which looks really, really nice. But again, you can go higher than 3 ray sample counts where the game becomes a lot more demanding. But hey, 3 is the ultra preset, and that is good enough for us. Now here, the 9070 XT pulled quite a bit ahead, at least compared to last time. We ended up averaging 62 FPS on this walking part, and we averaged 56 FPS on the 7900 XTX. For 1% lows, they were fairly close. 48 FPS average on the XT versus 42 FPS on the XTX for 1% lows. Now we do have a lot of ray tracing effects in this game, so I found it a bit surprising that they were actually this close. If you remember on the Cyberpunk results, the difference was massive, insanely so, which is why it leads me to believe that AMD's probably spent a lot of time optimizing for that game because it is used very, very frequently, you know, as a benchmark for ray tracing effects. And I get why. In the combat section this time around, the XTX didn't stumble all over the place. The 1% lows were actually a lot closer than they were previously. We did average 61 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 57 FPS on the 7900 XTX. So the difference isn't really massive there. For 1% lows, we had 51 FPS on the XT versus 46 FPS on the XTX. So yeah, there you have it, that the difference isn't really massive. And there is a lot of ray tracing effects here, guys, with 3 ray samples. I think the gap is smaller than I would have figured. Now, this isn't one of my image quality comparison type of videos, but I did look at the differences between 1 and 3 ray sample counts. The 3 ray sample counts is definitely more accurate as far as ray tracing goes. With 1 ray sample, it's a bit noisier, whereas with 3 ray samples, it's definitely a lot more stable. And as you can see, there is a cost, obviously. We're getting noticeably less FPS on both GPUs, but it's not really all that massive. Now, you increase that ray sample count some more, and it would be. But yeah, guys, this is Control on both GPUs. The next game is an absolute classic. It's Quake 2 RTX, and we're targeting 1440p again. And these are the settings that I'm using. As far as I'm aware, this was one of the first path tracing games, and I've always looked at it on my new GPUs because it's kind of interesting to look at. Now, the results were even more interesting. I ended up playing the game for about 10 minutes on both GPUs, and then we just looked at the averages and 1% lows in the end. And the 9070 XT was faster, but not by much. You would expect a lot more just looking at Cyberpunk's path tracing results, but it wasn't so. We averaged 95 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 82 FPS on the 7900 XTX. So not a massive difference, but the 1% lows, the 9070 XT was actually a little bit slower with 66 FPS versus 70 FPS on the 7900 XTX. It was the results I saw here that led me to believe that the results of Cyberpunk could be a result of AMD putting in a lot of work to optimize, because that is sort of a benchmark game, and Quake 2 RTX isn't a game that's really talked about all that much, but it is a game that I do like, and I make a point to at least take a look at it once on my new GPUs, because it is interesting. The next game I wanted to look at is Ratchet and Clank, and we're targeting 1440p, and we're using FSR native AA. We're going to use FSR 4 native AA on the 9070 XT versus FSR 3 native AA on the 7900 XTX. Now, if we just look at image quality wise, we have FSR 3 on the right and FSR 4 on the left. There's definitely noticeable differences, although it's not massive, just because here we're targeting native resolution, and FSR 3 at native did okay, but as you can see, there is a lot of aliasing around Clank while he's moving around with FSR 3 native versus FSR 4 is definitely a lot more stable. Especially with disocclusion artifacts, there's a noticeable difference when Clank jumps in the back of Ratchet. You can see it around his fur. With FSR 3, there's a lot more disocclusion artifacts and overall flickering. So yeah, FSR 4 makes a lot of good improvements, and it's a lot more impressive when you actually use it for upscaling, so FSR quality, balance, or performance. But at native AA, FSR 3 still did an okay job, a decent job. As far as actual gameplay, well, I played for about, I don't know, 10 to 15 minutes, and I wanted to show the different level instead of the one everyone shows the very beginning. Here we actually saw a pretty good difference, and this was a mixture of cinematics, exploration, and also a lot of combat. The 9070 XT ended up averaging 85 FPS versus 72 FPS on the 7900 XTX, so that's a pretty decent advantage. The 1% lows were very impressive. On the 9070 XT we had 65 FPS versus 51 FPS on the 7900 XTX. So yeah, the 9070 XT with all the ray tracing effects that Ratchet and Clank has was noticeably smoother overall, even though the average FPS wasn't as impressive. The 1% lows were pretty impressive. Now next, we're going to take a look at Avowed, and despite of what you might think about the game itself, in this regard, it's actually a pretty good example because it is an Unreal Engine 5 game that has support for software and hardware ray tracing. And as you can see, we have ray tracing toggled on, which means hardware ray tracing is enabled. And we're running it at 1440p, 100% with TSR. The game does have support for FSR, but it can only be used as upscaling, and we don't really need that. But back to the performance, here we have another case where there really isn't much of a difference if you didn't notice by looking at the numbers. As a matter of fact, they were practically tied, basically tied in average FPS anyway. We had 57 on the 9070 XT versus 56 on the XTX. Where there was more of a noticeable difference though, significantly so actually, was on the 1% lows. 48 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 37 FPS on the XTX. But then again, this is an Unreal Engine game where stutters are kind of like a lottery. So you could make the same run and they could be tied or close to it. But yeah, I'm not seeing really much of a gain here in this example. The next game I'm going to take a look at is the recently upgraded GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with the maximum RT preset. So that adds a lot of ray tracing in the game. We get shadows, reflections, GI, AO, and it actually looks really nice. It makes the game look really, really nice. Now, the game does have a built-in benchmark, and I did take a look at it, but it's kind of all over the place, and it wouldn't really give us accurate 1% lows. So I just took a drive and we took a look at a building, some ray trace reflections. And again, I'm going to keep saying it because it does transform the game quite a bit, and it's a good opportunity to play through the story again, which I actually never have on PC. But that's besides the point. Now, this was another game where there was a difference, but it wasn't a massive difference. We ended up averaging 105 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 91 FPS on the 7900 XTX. There was a fairly noticeable difference in 1% lows. Again, 84 on the 9070 XT versus 76. So again, the 9070 XT shows that it can run fairly smoothly compared to 7900 XTX, which again was a GPU that ran pretty smoothly to begin with. But yeah, GTA 5, I would say, is a noticeable example, but again, nothing close to what we saw with Cyberpunk. The next game I want to take a quick look at was Age The Veilguard, and this is a different engine from all the other ones that we've looked at before. Again, we're targeting 1440p with FSR native AA, and this game has ray trace reflections, which we've turned on, and also ambient occlusion, and they're all set to ultra. This game's ray tracing is actually a bit demanding as well, also on the CPU, by the way. And the difference in this game, guys, well, there wasn't a difference actually. They were identical. We had 66 average FPS on the 9070 XT and 65 FPS on the 7900 XTX. And for 1% lows, they were again the same. 53 FPS for the 9070 XT versus 52 FPS for the 7900 XTX. So yeah, pretty strange. And there's going to be other games that are kind of like this, which is why I believe that, yes, I mean, clearly AMD has made architectural improvements to ray tracing without a question. But it just seems a bit different than other GPU generations where, you know, it is expected that you get, I don't know, from like 40 to 70% better ray tracing performance. But in this generation, it seems like it could be either the same or up to like 40 or maybe even 50% better. So I wonder if this architecture needs to work with the driver in order to get the most out of the hardware. Now, I know this goes for pretty much every hardware out there, but for this one in particular, it might require a little more attention. At least that's kind of the conclusion that I've come to just based off the results that I'm seeing. I mean, I don't know, but it just kind of what it looks like to me anyway. Right, now the next game we're going to take a look at is the Callisto Protocol at 1440p, and this game has multiple ray tracing effects. We got shadows, reflections, and transmissions. Now this game, I would say, is probably the best example of an AMD sponsored ray tracing game, and I actually quite like the game. I know it didn't do all that well, but I thought it was actually pretty good. Now I do realize that the footage looks a little bit stuttery. For whatever reason, this game didn't jive all that well with my capture card apparently, but it is just a capture. As you can tell, frame times are actually very smooth. The game ran really well on both GPUs. It actually ran a bit weller on the 7900 XTX because this is the first game, as far as I'm aware, that the 9070 XT lost to the 7900 XTX. We ended up averaging 105 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 110 on the 7900 XTX. And for 1% lows, we had 63 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 69 FPS on the 7900 XTX. So yeah, the RDNA 3 GPU is ahead here on both averages and 1% lows. Not by a lot, but the fact that it's ahead is a bit unusual and kind of what leads me to believe that this architecture might require a bit more attention from AMD, more so than usual, to take full advantage of the improved ray tracing architecture. Because normally you see it gain at least across the board. It could be like 20 to 40%, but I don't think I've ever seen 0 to 30 or 40%. So it is a bit unusual. At least I can't say that I've noticed this before. With other architectures like RDNA 2 and RDNA 3. RDNA 3 was always ahead, no matter what. Now, the range could depend on the game. Of course, that is the case with every architecture, but not to this degree. I mean, at least that's what I think. I don't know. You guys leave a comment below and let me know. If you have any other examples, I'd love to hear them. The next game I wanted to show you guys is Sackboy A Big Adventure. I wanted to add a couple games that I personally like that have ray tracing, and just because, you know, everybody else has been showing the same games, including myself, by the way. I'm not that different, but I do like to add my own personal touch if I can, and this is a really fun game. I like my 3D platformers, and it is another Unreal Engine 4 game with ray tracing. Like we saw with Callisto Protocol, and it does have quite a bit of ray tracing actually, and it is a demanding game with ray tracing. Without, as you can see, we can get I don't know, close to 300 FPS, and it runs pretty well. I do suggest checking it out, by the way, if you like your 3D platformers. So without ray tracing, it runs really well, but with ray tracing, I ran into some really strange issues. Issues that I saw in a few other Unreal Engine 4 games, by the way. So as you can see here, ray trace reflections are extremely demanding in this game. There's 2 tiers of it, and then we have ray trace shadows and ambient occlusion. Now, I would say the 9070 XT does pretty well. We're getting 75 FPS. The problem, however, is that there's these moments where it'll stutter for a very long time. Like right now, we are going through a stutter that is lasting, I don't know, 5 seconds long. And the strange part of it is that it happens extremely frequently. And at first I thought that it maybe was a shader compilation stutter, because this game does have those issues sometimes, but it wasn't, because I ended up running the game again, and it just so happened that it would stutter. Same thing for like right now. We are going through another stutter, and I don't really understand why that's happening. But this is an NVIDIA sponsored game, but there's tons of other NVIDIA sponsored games that run really well on AMD GPUs. And right now we are going through another one of those very, very long stutters. It's quite unfortunate, because other than that, the 9070 XT actually performs really well, but this is very strange to see. Now, I also wanted to try the 7900 XTX and see how that does. So let's check it out. We'll go ahead and throw ray tracing on the 7900 XTX as well here at 1440p, by the way. And as you can see, actually the 9070 XT was better performing overall. And the 7900 XTX does actually go through those little stutters, but it's not nearly as long as it is on the 9070 XT, nor is it as frequent either. So it kind of leads me to believe that it could be something maybe architectural or driver-wise. I don't even know if AMD even bothered to optimize for this game, because this game didn't do all that well when it came out on. But I figured since I have my RTX 4090 in the PC next to me, why not check it out? As you can see, it does have DLSS and frame generation on an NVIDIA GPU. And sure, I mean, the 4090 is like doubling the FPS of the other GPU. It's a different tier GPU. That's not really the point here. I was just curious to see if those stutters would happen on the 4090 as well. And they actually don't. Well, they kind of do sometimes, because this is an Unreal Engine 4 games that can have some shader compilation stutters. So there is, they do pop up here and there, but it's not nearly to that same extent as it was on the Radeon GPUs, especially the 9070 XT, which was where it was the worst. And I get it, not many people are going to care, because this game, again, didn't really sell all that well, but it is a really fun game. It's not an easy game by any means. The first few levels are quite easy, but then it picks up and it becomes quite a bit more difficult. And it also has 4-player co-op. It's a perfect game to play, you know, if you have any kids or nieces or nephews, or even, I don't know, significant others or friends. You can just grab 4 controllers and you all play on the same map. It's a lot of fun. I do really like these games. Grew up with them, and I've enjoyed them ever since. And this is a very good one, and I think it actually looks really nice as well. It has some really nice ray tracing effects. The ray tracing effects do apply to a lot of different surfaces. It's not just glass that is reflective or anything like that. It applies to a ton of surfaces, and the different materials that they use. It's like a crafted world. I think the ray trace reflections especially make it pop and kind of come to life. So personally, I do like it. I do like the game, and I do enjoy the visuals as well. But yeah, that's one of the games I wanted to show, and also go over this like stuttering thing that doesn't even feel like a stuttering, but it feels more like it's loading. It feels like a loading. And by the way, I am using all Gen 4 NVMe SSDs on this PC. It's a brand new PC I just put together, brand new Windows, and Gen 5 Gen 5 PCIe, so the 9070 XT is running in Gen 5. So yeah, everything is brand new. And for the last game, I'll throw in another one that's kind of a favorite of mine, and that's the Ascent. This was one of the first Unreal Engine 4 games with ray tracing, and here we have ambient occlusion, reflections, and shadows. Now, this was another game where I did get a few of those hitches with the 9070 XT, and I did get some stutters on the 7900 XTX. This game had some problems with stuttering, but after playing for a while, it wasn't too bad. Now, clearly, as you can see, the 9070 XT is noticeably more capable. So this is one of the first Unreal Engine 4 games with ray tracing where the 9070 XT is probably the fastest, I would say. Actually, yeah, it was kind of similar to Sackboy A Big Adventure, maybe. Yeah, very comparable. But it is actually a very good game that nobody really talks about much, and I think it actually looks beautiful. It has an amazing soundtrack. It comes with the soundtrack if you buy the game, but it's like a twin stick shooter type of game. Action. There you go. There's that long, very long stutter on the 9070 XT. That is really long. It was like over 10 seconds long. The stutter does happen on the 7900 XTX as well, but not for as long. Like right there. It was... So, yeah, I don't know what's happening. I don't know why this is happening. I wouldn't say it's too concerning. I don't think anyone plays Unreal Engine 4 games with ray tracing these days. But it is unusual. And I don't know. I have a thing for unusual things. I like to point them out because it's kind of what makes it interesting whenever I look at these games. Is, you know, kind of talk about things and talk about what it maybe could be or why it's happening. Who knows? But either way, it is a good game. And worst case scenario, you can also force the game to run through DX11. Obviously, you won't have the ray tracing with DX11, but as a game, it's actually a really fun game. And also you can play in co-op as well, which is kind of what these games were made for. And it's a lot of fun without the stuttering, that is. But yeah, guys, that's going to be it for this video. This one came out to be pretty long, but I wanted to dig into the ray tracing and show you guys the differences between the 9070 and 7900 XTX. The differences are kind of all over the place. I mean, it can be from nothing to Cyberpunk, you know, where the differences are big. They're really big. So I guess time will tell going forward if it is a driver thing where AMD needs to put a bit more attention to take advantage of the additional hardware. Because it is kind of a departure what AMD is doing with RDNA 4 and how they handle ray tracing. It's a good thing, don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of ray tracing, and I like what AMD have done with RDNA 4. So I'm actually curious to see what happens going forward. But you guys leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. I do appreciate you guys watching. I do appreciate the feedback as well. So yeah, let me know what you think. But thanks. I'll see you on the next one.